The phone in my kitchen rang like a metronome that morning, steady and urgent, cutting through the steam of the chamomile I had set to steep. I let it ring twice while I smoothed the retirement certificate into the place I always kept important papers, between two cookbooks the spine cracked from decades of butter and flour, and then lifted it. The voice at the other end was Michael's, tight and tired, and he said three words that made the mug tremble in my hand. "It's over. We're in court." Stay with me through this one. If you want to hear exactly how evidence, a recorder in a shoebox, and a child's small, brave hands changed the course of a family, subscribe and hit the bell. There are more stories like this coming, and I promise you there's something in the telling that might help someone you love. I put the phone down and looked at the clock. The little hand hovered near 9. The minute hand moved with the patient anger of something that has seen you cry before and will watch you rise again. There was a suitcase in the hallway, Brooke's, or rather, the last one I had seen Brooke pack in a hurry, and an old song from the upright piano in the parlor hummed through my head, because there are some sounds that never leave you. That morning, the house felt like an instrument tuned to a wrong key. I am Helen. I taught first grade for 40 years. My Annans remember how to count change in pennies and how to sew a ripped seam while a child watches with wide, intent eyes. Those hands are freckled with years and stained with the tomato sauce of 100 Sunday dinners. When my husband died, the world narrowed to diapers and PTA leadings and a salary that begged to be stretched. Michael was 3 then. I learned to be both a father and a mother in the space between the school bell and bedtime stories. I never expected that the job would end in this kind of courtroom light. Michael's marriage to Brooke began, in the telling I prefer, like any young couple's: laughter, shared bills, someone from outside who pulled the corners of our small life into new shapes. Brooke arrived with bright scarves and camera-ready smiles, with stories of cities she'd visited, and a knack for making me feel both seen and small. She was, for a time, an answer. But answers change. People do too. At first, I noticed small slippages. Aiden, who used to eat the last pancake with a grin, started declining my cooking, saying he preferred protein shakes because they help with focus. Chloe learned to mimic phrases that weren't hers. Leo clung to his backpack like luggage at an airport. Michael worked longer shifts. Brooke took trips that blurred into months. The house they lived in looked like a magazine spread, fresh paint, a car always in the driveway. But on visits, the children's stories were thin as tissue, and Brooke's smile had a way of arriving late, like someone practicing joy. I began to collect things the way a cautious animal gathers moss for winter. A receipt left on a foyer table, a screenshot Michael accidentally left open on his phone when he dozed on the sofa, travel confirmations to a beach when he thought his job necessitated overtime, texts that suggested the children were better occupied elsewhere. I'm a teacher. There's a certain muscle for noticing the small, repetitive things, the copied words, the habit of scratching the same line in the margin. Trouble, if you know where to look, leaves handwriting. Carol noticed too. Carol has been my friend since we both taught the scrawled handwriting of first graders into something legible. She has a laugh like wind through wheat and a stubborn streak that made her volunteer at every school bake sale. When I told her, quietly, that Michael seemed adrift and the children returned from their visits with eyes that watched more than played, she brought a recorder and the kind of practical solution old teachers carry in pockets. "If nobody hears it on paper, they'll need sound," she said. We started small and sensible. Carol came over one evening with a library of old patients and a battery of recording devices hidden in shoeboxes and seed packets. We did not slap a recorder under someone's pillow and call it a day. We followed conversations, the way a gardener follows the path of root to see what is feeding what. I learned how to back up a file to a USB, how to make folders that anyone who opened them would see. Evidence. Dated. We labeled things the way I had labeled jars of jam for years. Clear, practical names so a stranger could find the sweetness without guessing. Evidence is, in its way, a kind of mercy. It turns suspicion, so private, so wasting, into something that can be set on a table and turned. An accusation whispered in the dark is easy to blow away. An audio clip that plays 3 times and 3 different neighbors recognize the voice. There you have a hinge. For us, the hinge came in a voice file Carol captured, shaky at first as if someone were speaking through fabric, then clear enough to cut. "I'll make it look like they're unreasonable," Brooke can be heard saying, to someone who answered back with the hum of complicity I hoped I never had to hear in my family. "They'll beg for the kids to be with me. I'll book the tickets. Mike will be too tired to fight. You know how he is." The voice is not melodramatic. It is the smooth, manual calculation of someone used to making people follow a plan. I listened to that recording with my hands pressed to my chest because there is a kind of physical pain that is not new but reopens as if made of fresh glass. I remembered Michael as a boy taking off his shoes before he stepped on the oak floor, a ritual of respect he had learned from me. I listened to my son's voice in conversations that followed, thin and apologetic, as if he were always explaining away a fault line. We began to gather. Bank statements. This system. Michael and I had practiced testimony in whispers, but not this. She walked to the table where the court clerk kept a small laptop, the one used to play recordings for evidence, and she said with a voice that felt both like my piano and like a child's stubby pen, "Can I show something?" My heart stopped on a certain beat. There are people who say children have no agency in court. They are adorable, pliable witnesses. But I watched the way Chloe's knuckles whiten as she opened a folder she had carried in her backpack, a folder marked "My Truth" in a child's careful handwriting, and the way the judge, after a moment, inclined his head and allowed it. She had taken, in the weeks before, a video on my old phone that she had somehow learned to use. It was a small, trembling thing, shot in a parked car. Brooke's voice crisp and unguarded. "We do it this way," Brooke said into the camera, and then to someone out of frame. "We make them ask to stay. We make them think it's their idea to go on the trip. We get them used to the idea that their other home is a holiday." There was a note of triumph in the voice that made the air in the courtroom cold. The clip cut then to Brooke, smiling, and to the children playing in a rented house, a suitcase on the porch. In the video, short, unornamented, like a secret left in a purse, Brooke said plainly, "If he fights, we leave anyway. He's too tired to fight." The little body language cues were ruinous, an assurance of power, a plan spoken aloud. When the video ended, the sound of the courthouse seemed louder for the absence. I could hear my own breath. Carol, sitting in the back, had her hand over her mouth. Lauren, who had stood by us all through the paperwork, looked at the judge with a steadiness I wanted to borrow. Michael's slim figure folded in on himself for a second. Then he exhaled, a sound like someone who had been carrying an ocean and finally found shore. "Play it again," the judge said. Courtrooms are a theater that thrives on pacing. Evidence played twice becomes less like a clip and more like a confession laid bare. The prosecutor, who until then had watched with a cautious eye, shifted. The clerk stamped forms with a sense of business that felt almost tender. Brooke's earlier composure fractured. She blinked, as if realizing that into the casualness of her plan had been woven an outcome she had not predicted: scrutiny. Allegations were filed. An investigation that same week bore more statements. There were interviews, dry, formal, the sort of moments where the truth comes out in the margins, the way a child hesitates, the bruise of a story told in small fragments. Lauren wrote a report. Dr. Wallace testified about the pattern experts call coaching, the way a parent can feed lines that become a child's shield. Mr. Martinez moved with the deliberate steps of someone who understands how to make a system listen. Brooke did not shout or sob in court. She did something colder. She smiled in small increments and accused us in a statement of overreach. "They've turned him against me," she said, and the line was familiar to anyone who has seen a manipulator try to reverse blame. But the bank statements and recordings are stubborn, grammatical things. They speak in a ledgered truth. We won a temporary custodial arrangement with supervised visitation. We got a restraining order that limited Brooke's travel with the children and demanded notice. Those legal phrases sound sterile on paper, but to us they were scaffolding. We protected small bodies from sudden uprooting and gave Michael time to become the father he had, all along, been trying to be under the weight of exhaustion and blame. The fallout was not a clean cleaving of villain and victim. Brooke appealed, called friends to testify to her charm, and spoke of stress and sacrifice. She lost some work when the reality of the records followed the opening of an investigation into alleged fraud. Transfers labeled for maintenance and babysitting that flowed outward in a pattern that could not be explained away. She withdrew into other towns, her social invitations thinning. People at the park who had once waved began to whisper. It was not a public execution of character. It was more like a slow erosion, an unmasking that leaves a stranger in the place of a neighbor. Meanwhile, the real work began. The children had to relearn that a home could be steady. We moved slowly with them, like gardeners transplanting a root. There were days when Aiden would slam a door and storm into the yard. We let him, then asked him to come back and hammer a board for the fence. Chloe found her way to the piano and worked at scales until her hands memorized a willingness to stay in one task. Leo learned the old lullaby I used to sing. His voice, high and honest, stitched something back into my chest. Therapy was not magic. Dr. Wallace gave us tools. He taught me to frame choices simply. Would you rather fix the fence or clean the playroom? He'd ask. And the children would choose, and the choosing was a tiny reclaiming of agency. He taught Michael to sit without filling silences with explanations, to be present without performing. He taught us to let children have feelings without making them into battles. There were moments of grief that are soft and deep. Michael and I would sit at the kitchen table with late coffee and sometimes not talk about anything dramatic, just the weather, the mail. I watched him relearn being a father. I watched him sign forms that made him legally responsible in ways he had been emotionally before. He mended fences with the same hands I had taught him to plant with. The work of parenting can be humbling. It can be a recovery of muscle memory for someone who once learned to be small in order to survive. As for Brooke, the law moved at its own pace. Fraud investigations do not always end in dramatic verdicts. System. Text-to-speech generation. System. Text-to-speech generation. Mayo. Mantengo fluxo y la conexión. Connect con ERC and therapy and the humility to accept help. It is friends like Carol who bring a recorder with no lecture, and professionals like Lauren and Dr. Lauren who translate human pain into steps. It is the courage of one small child to press play. There are days I lie awake and remember the recording as if it were a line of weather, gray and unavoidable. But then a hand touches mine in the kitchen, little fingers sticky with jam, and I remember that the best story we tell is the one we live after the storm. We made pancakes on a Sunday, and Aiden told me about a math problem he had solved. Chloe played a melody that made the neighbors stop and smile. Leo fell asleep on the couch with his head on my lap, a book open across his chest. Those are the proofs that matter. If you've stayed with me this long, thank you. If this stirred something in you, whether anger, relief, or recognition, please consider sharing this story, subscribing, and leaving something in the comments about a time you helped someone be safe. We live smaller and safer when we know each other's stories. There is more to tell: small sequences of court dates, appeals, the slow return of trust. But the arc is here. Evidence gathered, a child's courage that changed a hearing, legal boundaries that allowed children to sleep without the sound of suitcases zipping, and a grandmother who learned that the hands that mended are also the hands that must stand guard. I learned, finally, to use my voice the way I had taught my students to: clear, patient, and never without instruction. Sometimes, late, I sit at the piano and play the melody Chloe learned. The clock ticks, the tea grows cold, the house hums. Outside, a family walks by, and I know how fragile that rhythm is, not because I fear it will break, but because I learned what happens when someone tries. We held fast, we made a place safe, and in the end, that is enough to go on with. The slow machinery of the courthouse kept turning. After the first hearing where Chloe's recording had cut a channel through the pretense, there followed a string of smaller hearings that felt like stitches. Motions to clarify the parenting plan, a status conference to set therapy requirements, an evidentiary hearing to admit the recording formally. None of it had the melodrama people imagine, no thunderous denunciations or triumphant music cues, just rooms filled with paper, lawyers who learned to speak plainly to one another, and the judge who read longer passages than she spoke. We spent those mornings in shifts. Michael took the early train when work allowed. I took the late bus so the kids could have breakfast. Sometimes the kids came into the courthouse foyer and chose a book from the rack while we waited. It became an odd ritual. The metal detectors, the sound of the elevator, the small concession stand that sold coffee and stale muffins. There was a dignity to it, the slow insistence that institutions could be made to respond if you kept showing up. The slow machinery of the courthouse kept turning. After the first hearing where Chloe's recording had cut a channel through the pretense, there followed a string of smaller hearings that felt like stitches, motions to clarify the parenting plan, a status conference to set therapy requirements, an evidentiary hearing to admit the recording formally. None of it had the melodrama people imagine, no thunderous denunciations or triumphant music cues, just rooms filled with paper, lawyers who learned to speak plainly to one another, and the judge who read longer passages than she spoke. We spent those mornings in shifts. Michael took the early train when work allowed. I took the late bus so the kids could have breakfast. Sometimes the kids came into the courthouse foyer and chose a book from the rack while we waited. It became an odd ritual. The metal detectors, the sound of the elevator, the small concession stand that sold coffee and stale muffins. There was a dignity to it, the slow insistence that institutions could be made to respond if you kept showing up. Brooks' attorney tried to attack the perimeter of what changed the case, the circumstances under which the video had been recorded, its provenance, the chain of custody. For a few weeks, we learned legal phrases we had never meant to know: authentication, spoliation, relevancy. We sat with Lauren and Dr. Wallace before hearings. They rehearsed in ways that were practical, not theatrical. They taught Chloe how to answer a question without being led, how to hold still when someone tried to hurry her. The kids practiced small things with me at home. Look at the lawyer when you speak. Take a breath before you say yes or no. Simple courtesies, but they formed armor. At one hearing, a technician from the county's evidence unit took the stand and spoke with patient, almost apologetic clarity about file metadata, timestamps, logs that confirmed the recording state. It mattered in a way that felt both ridiculous and necessary. Justice often needs its paperwork clean. The judge admitted the video into evidence at the next session. Even then, victory felt incremental. The law is methodical and often conservative by design. It corrects, it hesitates, it looks for proofs that are slow to gather. During these weeks, Michael began to say things that had surprised me. He enrolled in a parenting class that met on Tuesday nights. He called the kids' school and set up a separate meeting with Mr. Martinez to talk about accommodations during test weeks. He started to tell the boys, in a way that was halting and half ashamed, about his own upbringing, how his father had taught toughness at the cost of tenderness. He did not make excuses, he only tried to change the script. Those admissions were small fireworks, fragile but bright enough to mark progress. Therapy filled the afternoons. The children's therapist, Leah, used play as a language. She sat on the rug and made forts of pillows and let the kids tell stories they could not yet name. With Chloe, she mapped feelings to colors: red for anger, blue for sadness, yellow for happiness. Chloe drew a lot of green, plants, trees, the piano, when she was calm. Aiden, who had once been a small, hard knot of seriousness, learned to draw stick figure comics about a math hero who solved problems by asking for help. Leo, if he felt brave, would drape a stuffed bear over his shoulder and tell jokes. There were bad days. A notice would arrive from an appeals court that sent the family reeling for a morning. A bureaucratic delay in scheduled therapy could make a child regress. On those mornings, we sometimes retreated to ritual. Pancakes, the old radio turned to static, a long walk where we pretended the pavement was a country road. Those practices of ordinary care were our ballast. Outside the legal architecture, life threaded itself. The sewing classes at the library became more than a place to learn hymns. Women came with sleeves rolled to the elbow and stories knotted with their projects. A woman named System. It had sat mute for months, its strings dull with disuse, but the tuner, Mrs. Alvarez from across the street, arranged it one Saturday and told Chloe with a smile that the notes would come back. Chloe, who had been secretive with the melody she had taught herself, let it spill out in the afternoons now. She would sit and play a round of the simple tune while Leo built cities of blocks on the living room carpet and Aiden graded his own math quizzes with a ruler because that was how he liked to be exact. Once, a neighbor stopped on the walkway and leaned over the fence to listen. She clapped at the end. The sound was small but true. The school found practical ways to protect the children's anonymity when needed. Mr. Martinez, who had become a quiet ally, arranged for Chloe and Aiden to have alternate pickup points when the occasional reporter tried to lurk by the school gate. He also advocated for the kids' curricular needs, extra time on tests, quiet spaces for refocusing, a teacher aide who could check in when transitions were hard. Those small adjustments made school feel less like a series of hurdles and more like a place where the children could be children. One winter, the PTO organized a music night. It was nothing large, folding chairs in the gym, a paper banner that said family night, and a table of punch that was always suspiciously watered down. Chloe was asked, unexpectedly, to play the final piece. She stood at the piano with her back ramrod straight and her hands a little pale at the edges. Then she let the melody run. The gym, with its fluorescent lights and strange acoustics, filled with a sound that made the air feel as if it had been polished. Parents who had only nodded in the hallways sat with their hands folded in their laps. Michael watched her with an expression that had the stunned softness of someone who had been allowed to watch a small miracle happen again and again. After the performance, people sought us out with things to say that were almost embarrassingly ordinary. "You must be proud. Your daughter is very brave. Thank you for sharing." Those sentences were clumsy attempts to translate complex gratitude into social language, but they mattered. A woman I'd met in the sewing class, Jen, pressed a homemade thermos into my hands, wrapped in a tea towel. "For the mornings," she said. There were logistical hardships, too. Insurance paperwork for therapy would sometimes take 3 weeks to resolve. A therapist would change insurance panels and leave us scrambling. Daycare subsidies came with forms that seemed specifically designed to be discouraging. I learned to keep a folder labeled bureaucracy on the kitchen table where I put deadlines and copies of everything. It was not heroic, it was a kind of maintenance. Still, the maintenance kept the rhythm. At times, grief would find a way through the cracks. There were nights when one or another of the children would have nightmares that sent them bolting into the hallway and waking the house. On those nights, we took turns lying awake, holding a small body until the breath slowed. In the morning, over oatmeal that had been made too thin, we would talk in the kind of plain language that treats sorrow like a weather report. "It's storming. We will stay inside until it clears." The language of prediction and shelter became a kind of catechism for safety. Michael's own therapy opened deeper rooms. He began to confront, not with excuses, but with sorrow, the ways his silence had sheltered abuse. He attended a men's group where they practiced accountability and honest speech. He would come home and name a simple regret. "I was too quiet when I should have spoken up," and then follow it with action, attending a school meeting, taking a turn at bedtime stories, bringing home the ingredients for a dinner he had never cooked before. The children saw him attempt small, consistent kindnesses, and those accumulated into trust. There were also days when the world reminded us of its unpredictability. A headline, a chance encounter with someone who knew Brooke and felt compelled to comment, an offhand question from a relative who did not understand boundaries. All of these could tip the balance for a morning. On such mornings, we practiced our response: calm explanation, deferral to the plan, a refusal to discuss details that belonged to the children's privacy. The adults around us learned to say, without drama, "We are focusing on the children's well-being right now." It was a protective formula that, repeated often enough, discouraged the gossip and the prying. Small civic gestures emerged, too. I testified a few times at meetings about the need for clearer school protocols for families in transition. A councilwoman from the neighboring ward who had heard about the sewing classes invited me to speak about community resilience at a local forum. I declined the microphone twice, but I sent a short statement that was read aloud. What keeps children safe is not one grand reform. It is the willingness of neighbors to notice, of professionals to act, and of families to support one another. The statement was ordinary enough, but it helped shift a conversation about funding for family services into one that centered practical supports. One of the more unexpected outcomes of the month that followed was how the story of the video had given others permission to speak. Carol told me months later of a friend who had finally gone to the police after years of fear. A teacher in another district asked if she could send copies of the home safety literature we had assembled to her faculty. These ripples did not always make big headlines, but they made small changes. Safety plans in desks, a binder in the office labeled Community Resources, a room at the library reserved for confidential conversations. As the first year after the hearing drew to a close, the calendar settled into a kind of predictable steadiness. We celebrated birthdays in low-key ways. A pizza ordered in, a cake that said 8 in messy icing, presents that were small and thoughtful. Chloe insisted that the neighborhood cat be allowed a ribbon for the occasion. Leo wanted to invite one friend over and, under his anxious eye, agreed on a short visit with a worksheet as a negotiated activity. Aiden announced at dinner that he had solved a math problem that had haunted him for a week and explained it with a flourish that made us all laugh. One Sunday afternoon, the four of us sat in the living room, the piano lending a gentle hum, and made a list of things we wanted for the next year. Not wishes so much as intentions. More music, one camping trip, learn to bake bagels. We wrote them in a child's handwriting on a sheet of paper and stuck them on the fridge with a magnet that read, "Slow work." It was a small domestic manifesto. Between these ordinary victories, there were still professional requirements to meet. Annual reviews of the parenting plan, a final hearing to render the modifications permanent at the jurisdictional level. I sat in the courtroom for that sitting, feeling the peculiar, almost embarrassing gratitude of someone who had been through an ordeal and survived with small dignity intact. The judge, older, practical, precise, reviewed the filings and asked 3 succinct questions about follow-up care and monitoring. She closed the file with an instruction that was less dramatic than the relief it brought. "Maintain therapeutic engagement," she said. "Notify the court if anything changes." It felt like both an end and a continuing charge. Afterward, as we walked out into a winter sun that made the courthouse plaza glitter, Michael took my hand. He did not make declarations about heroism or transform his past with a single sentence. He said simply, "We will keep doing the small things." That was enough. There are moments when I still hear that recording in my head, echoes that slid into my sleep on the worst nights. But more often now, it is the hum of everyday rituals that hold me. The kettle's soft whistle, Chloe's fingers finding the right chord, Leo's breath as he falls asleep at my side with a book splayed open, Aiden's precise explanations of arithmetic like tiny telescopes toward order. Those sounds do not erase what happened to us, nor should they. They are instead the honest counterweight to it. Evidence not of a single decisive act, but of a life rebuilt in the margins where care is given again and again. There is still work ahead. The case, while largely resolved, required periodic reporting. There were forms to submit, reviews to attend, a slowly loosening restriction on Brooke that meant we had to remain vigilant about boundaries. We scheduled a meeting with school staff in the spring to update safety protocols. System. They were trivial things, and they were scaffolding. The meeting at the school was practical and unflashy. The counselor sat across from us and outlined safety plans: who would escort Chloe at dismissal, how teachers would monitor transitions between rooms. There was a moment when the counselor asked, gently, whether Chloe wanted to speak in that meeting. Chloe shook her head and squeezed my hand. She preferred to say things in music, and so, later, when she played the melody in our kitchen, it felt like testimony, small, stubborn, and true. Every so often, a night would give me one of those older, intrusive echoes, a sound from the court recording, a silhouette in a hall. They came and went, fierce and brief. Between them, there was the steady work of living, a dentist appointment, a call to the intake social worker, a slow, patient session with the family therapist where Michael and I fumbled through sentences and then, despite the awkwardness, found each other at the comma of them. Neighbors did the ordinary kindnesses: soup left at the door, a note promising to water plants while we were at appointments, and those acts felt like votes cast on our behalf. We kept records and prepared forms. We taught the children words for boundaries and practiced exits from hypothetical situations in the living room, as if rehearsal might one day be armor. Most of all, we kept doing the small things: pancakes and piano, homework at the kitchen table, bedtime stories read with deliberate slowness. It was not dramatic salvation. It was a life assembled out of tiny, repeated choices to be present, to notice, to respond. In that assembling, there was a kind of quiet courage, less a single victorious moment than a prolonged, weary, tender insistence on continuing. I folded yet another permission slip into Chloe's backpack, and, before she left for school, I kissed the freckle at the corner of her mouth that was always there when she worried. She smiled, and for a while the world held.